Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and it is week 2 here in History 480 here at Eastern Oregon University. History 480, 1900 to 1945, 20th Century American History Part 1. And we have a number of different things that we're going to be doing this week. First of all, our readings. We are going to be reading from our textbook, A Time of Paradox by Glenn Jeansone. We're reading Chapter 2, and that chapter kind of looks at American foreign policy between the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. It is a very short reading, and we're going to have a quiz on that reading. The quiz, it's multiple choice true false. It's like 5 questions. I put it together myself based on the reading and some of the key points that I think come out of the reading. So it shouldn't be too difficult. If you do the reading and you use your highlighter and make notes and highlights on the reading, you should have no problem on this very short quiz. The quiz has a 20-minute time limit, so make sure you don't expect to look everything up. But it is a very short chapter, so it's probably not going to be the most difficult quiz that you've ever had. But read the chapter carefully, and we'll be engaging that in the discussion forum in addition to the quiz. We also have 2 other readings I want us to examine this week. One of them, of course, comes from one of our assigned texts for the class, which is Benevolent Assimilation by Stuart Crichton Miller. And then there's another reading sort of connected to that, and this is by Hunt and Levine. It is from a book called Arc of Empire, and it's just the introduction for that book. And that's posted as a PDF in modules in Canvas. I want you to be looking at both of those books, both of those readings, particularly with respects to benevolent assimilation. I want you to probably focus most on the first chapter, which is titled Aberration or Continuity, American Imperialism, Aberration or Continuity. And you might also look at the prelude, or the epilogue of that book as well, because it might help you in thinking about the answer to this aspect of the discussion forum this week. I want us to think a little bit about American foreign policy and historiography. Historiography is basically the examination of what historians have said over time about a particular topic. And it's very important. If any of you ever go on to graduate work or to write an original work of history, understanding historiography, how historiography has changed, is one of the most important first steps to being able to write an original work of history. You need to be able to understand how the material that you're writing fits with the already written material. How does it engage the work of other scholars? And so my PhD, which I did at Washington State University, very close to Eastern Oregon University in La Grande, my PhD is in American foreign relations, United States and the world. And so I have a video lecture in modules for you on American foreign policy and historiography. And then I want you to particularly focus on reading the short introduction of the Hunt and Levine reading in PDF and the first chapter of Stuart Crichton Miller's book, Benevolent Assimilation. You also might look at the epilogue of that book as well, because it might help you to kind of understand where Miller's coming from. I want you to consider where those 2 authors sort of fit with the overall historical narrative, the historiography of American empire. We're particularly going to be thinking about, was American empire an aberration, or was it a case of continuity? Meaning that, and this is something that scholars, as you'll notice from the weekly lecture, scholars have sort of discussed and debated this for a number of years. And in the 50s and 60s, most scholars on this topic tended towards, at least during some of the 60s, that's the emergence of the so-called New Left. So it changes, the New Left in historical scholarship, it changes a little bit. But in the 50s particularly, and in much of the, or some of the 60s, scholars of this topic tended to suggest that the empire, the American empire that emerged with the Spanish-American and the Philippine-American War between 1899 and 1902, was an aberration. that America was an imperialistic power, and that this was kind of a one-moment event in American history that America then left and went away from. Since the mid-late 60s and on, many scholars of this topic, from Walter Lefebvre to to a number of others, have argued really that the United States as an empire is really a case of continuity, that the United States did not in one moment become an empire then leave it, that the United States was effectively developing its imperialistic impulse for a long period of time in a sort of continuity. Walter Lefebvre, William Appleman Williams were particularly significant in making that argument that the United States was actually more imperialistic in its history than in a continuous sort of nature, rather than as a brief aberration of American history, as some scholars have argued. And Walter Lefebvre championed the idea that the United States should be considered an informal empire. And so I discussed that at greater length in the weekly lecture. So be sure you watch that and then look at those relatively two short segments from Miller, the first chapter, and probably the epilogue will be helpful too, and then the Hunt and Levine introduction PDF, which is very short as well. But it's a very important sort of in understanding the historiography of American foreign policy and U.S. in the world. And of course, the answer to that carries a very great deal of significance with respects to how Americans think about the United States and the world. If we think that empire happened between 1898 and 1902 for a brief period of time, and the United States left this, then the way you think about other aspects of foreign policy in the future is going to be a little bit different than if you think that the Philippine-American War was part of a continuous sort of history of the imperial impulse in American history. That is going to shape how you think about the era of manifest destiny before it. It's also going to shape how you think about things like the Vietnam War later in the 1960s and 70s, and even beyond. Okay. Also important to remember, we have a book review on Stuart Crichton Miller, Benevolent Assimilation, that is due the end of next week. I have very specific guidelines on the book review, and I'm posting those for you. They're also in the syllabus. Be sure you see those. Make sure you follow those guidelines to the letter. And the reason we do that is because if you go on to graduate work and professional work as a scholar in history, when a journal asks you to write a book review and they say we want a 600-word book review, it needs to be 600 words. You can't write if you write 1,000, they're gonna either not publish it or they're gonna send it back to you and say get it within the word length. Journals are very specific on that. And actually writing a 600-word book review on a book, an entire book, can be very challenging to be able to get at the major themes, to be able to give the reader a feeling of what is this book like, what does this book read like, what is the argument of the book, how does it fit, what kind of sources does it use, what are the major sort of trajectories in the book. That can be very challenging. So we'll be submitting that at the end of next week, and I have some guidelines up there. I've also posted 2 sample book reviews for you. One is a book review that I wrote about a book called The Salvadoran Crucible last year for the Journal of Military History, and another is a book review of my own book by Teresa Keeley, who is a professor at the University of Louisville. And so I just provided those as, sort of just a basic model for what, book reviews look like. And of course, you can go into the digital system in our library databases, and you can search for book reviews as well to help you write a good book review. So that's due at the end of next week. So we need to be thinking about that. So make sure, we're looking at 2 specific areas of benevolent assimilation this week, but we should be reading the whole book to help us write the best review we possibly can. Okay, last bit. Now for the fun extra credit part of the announcements that we'll be doing every announcement during the term from here on out. This is how the extra credit works. When I make an announcement, I'm going to give you a historical factoid. And all you have to do to get extra points is to email me that historical factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight. Send me an email and just say the factoid for this week. Wow, that's a very loud plane. The factoid, email me and say the factoid for this week was such and such and such and such. Just summarize it as you need to summarize it. Email it to me no later than Wednesday by midnight. And the reason I do that is because I want you watching these announcements early in the week. I want you to be thinking about the class. I want you to be kind of receiving my input on what's going on during the week, early in the week. So you get started, you get thinking earlier, because if you begin earlier in the week, it's going to really help your ability to learn the material and to succeed in class. Each factoid is worth 1 point. So we have 9 more. We have 9 total. If you do all of them, I give you a bonus point, and you get 10 potential bonus points, and I add them to one of your test scores at the end of the term. It can be the difference between 2.5 to 3 points on a final grade if you do all of them, and that can mean, that could mean a B plus or an A minus. It can mean an A minus or an A plus. It can mean a C plus or a B minus. Heaven forbid it means the difference between a D plus and a C minus, because I want everybody to do much better than that. But we're talking about 2.5 to 3 points on your final grade. So it's kind of a fun way to earn some extra credit. Just summarize the factoid and email that factoid to me no later than Wednesday by midnight of the week that I give it. Okay, so here's the factoid, the first factoid of this term. One aspect of what you might call the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which of course was Theodore Roosevelt's assertion that the United States had a right to intervene and police the Americas as it saw in its best interest for the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine resulted in a myriad of interventions in Latin America. There were interventions in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, in Cuba, and of course also in Nicaragua. The United States intervened in Nicaragua during the presidency of William Howard Taft in 1909, 1910. And the United States intervention in Nicaragua was basically resulted in a continual presence of the United States Marines from 1909, 1910 until 1933 in Nicaragua. And this, of course, shaped the Nicaraguan government. This shaped the Nicaraguan military. The Nicaraguan Revolution of 1978 and 79, the Sandinista Revolution, was a revolution against this government that the United States sort of, over that period of time, eventually helped lead into power the government of the Somoza family that was sort of run in a part through its military, the National Guard, or the Guardia Nacional. In the late 20s, and here's the factoid, I'll make it quick because I'm running long here. In the late 20s, the United States faced an uprising. There were 2 major sort of Nicaraguan civil wars, if you will. The first one was between 1909 and 1912 that I just mentioned, and the latter was between 1926, 27, and 1933. In the latter, the United States fought a guerrilla war against revolutionaries that supported Augusto Cesar Sandino. And in that revolution in the late 20s, the United States, we see the first really example of the United States using air power to combat a guerrilla insurgency. The United States used, biplanes, an aircraft of, airplane technology really emerged in the First World War. And it's during the Nicaraguan War from 1927 to 1933, in which the United States applied air power to fight the forces of Augusto Cesar Sandino, using relatively primitive aircraft to drop weapons like phosphorus bombs, to strafe enemy positions, to act as reconnaissance, to fly the wounded when possible out of combat zones, and to generally combat the forces of the Nicaraguan guerrilla leader Augusto Cesar Sandino. So that's the factoid. 1927 to 1933, the United States fought in Nicaragua. The U.S. Marines fought against the revolutionary guerrilla leader, excuse me, Augusto Cesar Sandino. And in fighting Sandino, made use, for its case, for the first time, the usage of air power to combat a guerrilla insurgency. Just email me the gist of that factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight and get your bonus point applied to a test score at the end of the term. Let's have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm sorry that went so long.